I want to talk to you about a few things here before we get going. Of course, most of you are pretty curious about this stick I got in my hand, aren't you?
You're going to play in the fire with it like all the other kids.
You guys have seen me carry stuff to storytelling before, and you know it's got something to do with it. And I'll just give you something to think about for a while. Later on in this story, this stick's going to turn into a pretty special stick.
Are you going to make us cry again?
I don't think so.
Okay.
So much emotional
And storytelling, reading stories and programs and beautiful flag ceremonies from these ladies. I tell you, that was pretty special. That was pretty darn special. But in reality, you know, it seems like storytelling started in my life very early. Kind of an interesting thing. When I was 6 and 7, I'd go to bed at night, and of course Mom and Dad was always pretty punctual about getting up to bed about sundown, and I wasn't that tired. Being young like that, I wasn't that sleepy. Now I cherish the idea of going to bed early. But back then, I'd lay there in my bed at night, and stories would formulate in my brain, and it was kind of interesting at such an early age that I do that, and I was talking with Dave and Jesse the first day we was up here, and we was talking about that different stuff. And no, it was the last weekend, I think.
It was last weekend.
It was like last weekend we was talking about it.
The first day we were all up here.
And I've had this word in my brain ever since I was 6 or 7 years old, and I, actually voiced that word, Jesse, for the very first time. And I'm going to share that with you tonight because in some respects, it's a little bit of who I am. At that particular time, I didn't realize that that's who I was, but that's who I seemed to be coming to being. Even at that early age, stories seemed to be able to formulate in my brain pretty easy. And then laying in bed at night trying to get to sleep, it would do that. And as I would create these little stories in my mind, for some reason, I don't know where this came from, but I called them sportions. That's an odd word, to call my stories sportions. And in the middle of the day, in the afternoon and stuff like that, I would think about going to bed that night, and I would be telling myself sportions. I mean, that was the dumbest thing, and I never forgot that, and I've never told anybody that. I mean, it's just one of those things, and all of us have got things that we kind of hold close and secret inside ourselves, and some of it is just BS anyway. It just doesn't amount to anything, and it's not noteworthy talking about. And in that particular word, it's just kind of funny. But I've told myself stories for years. I've only started telling people stories just in the last 2 or 3 years. Well, I've told scout stories for a long time. I've been a scoutmaster for a lot of years. I've told those scout stories for quite a while. But the stories that I've been telling recently to my family, it came to me about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. It came to me that I was supposed to start telling my stories. And I was supposed to start sharing my life with people so that they can learn from some of the experiences that I've had in my life. And some of these experiences that I've had in my life, I tell as a story or I write it down as a story. For some reason, I got a major desire to capture an event, things that would happen to me or experiences. I wanted to capture that on paper so that, and hopefully that I could write it in such a way that you as the reader could see what I saw and feel what I felt. And so that I could draw you into that story and you could become a part of that story. And hopefully tonight, in telling this particular story, I hope I can do half as good a job as I did last night. Last night turned out pretty good, and I hope tonight I don't bore you too bad with this story, and I hope it turns out pretty good. Different things going on in and around me, for some reason, will start to formulate a story. And when Ginger and I started to research different things about the ranch and finding out some of the histories of the ranch, we learned about the Pauley family. And the Pauley family was the first homesteaders that came into our area right here. It was Julius and what's that other one? Pauley, Cindy? Emil. I can never remember Emil. I want to call him Amos or something like that. I don't know why, but anyway, Julius and Emil, Polly, were two brothers, and they homesteaded approximately at the same time. And as we began to learn what had taken place, of course, the one Polly brother's cabin burnt down, and the ceiling fell in on their son when he went in there to retrieve the pay vouchers for the railroad that they was working up in the tie camps, and he lost his life. And that cabin was built right down on the end of Grandma's Hill. And then, knowing where the other Polly brother built his cabin up here on the water divide, on the creek, right there on our south corner, only thing that's left there is kind of foundation area, and there's nothing else there. These other homestead cabins, there's ruins and remains and logs, and in some cases they're in still pretty good shape, like that old barn over there. And so I'm assuming, this is just an assumption on my part, that that cabin burnt down too. And then, of course, the spring after Grandma and Grandpa bought the ranch, the big cabin burnt down right there. And so in essence, there's 3 fires that have taken place right here on the ranch, and my brain is working double time, and I conjured up a story to deal with those 3 fires, and I have entitled this particular story, The Fire Curse on Lone Mountain. If you look on the map, a topography map, Grandma's Hill is called Lone Mountain. And so in thinking about that, and all this stuff started popping into my head, and I kind of combined this story with a scout story I told out on the shore of the Great Salt Lake with my scouts one time. And that was a story dealing with Gunnison Island and Fremont Island, and I used some of the same characters out of those stories in conjunction with this story to kind of bring all of this about and to create this fire curse. The story begins in about 1840, somewhere in that area. The Shoshone Indians were, at that particular time, had developed into itself a mighty tribe of people. And Minnetonka was the main chief, but Minnetonka meant the father of many chiefs. And he had 4 or 5 sons, as a matter of fact. And all of them became chiefs, medicine men, and spiritual leaders of their people. And they became so large and so powerful that they had to divide into many groups, and so that they could spread out, or otherwise there wasn't enough game in any one particular area to support that larger group of Indians. And so these sons from Minnetonka started to take groups of people, and they would spread out and form their own tribe. Where they was at, this fire's getting to me here a little bit, so I'm going to move around a little bit as I tell you this story, and in a little bit it's going to get rather exciting.
Do you want us to move back?
But anyway, in the year of 1840, the Indian tribes all gathered at Twin Falls, and it was in the fall, or midsummer in the fall, the salmon run had started, and the salmon were going up the Snake River. And of course the Indian tribes would gather there, and that was their harvest. And they would catch fish and dry the fish, and that was one of their mainstays for all of their winter food. And so the Twin Falls gathering was a grand and glorious time. There was literally hundreds of them there, fishing on the Snake, and watching the fish climb the falls. And they was able to catch and net those fish, and then they would hang them on racks, and then they would dry, and they would start to store that food, and they would have a long storage of food for the winter of these fish. Winnetonka was one of the sons of the Minnetonka, and he chose the path of a spiritual leader. But he was a young man, a very young man, and he was being taught by his uncle, who was one of the greatest medicine men of the tribe. And he was tutoring, and he had been tutored by him for 6 months. And what he was doing, he was learning the chants and the medicine that had been handed down for generations and generations from his uncle, and so that he could protect and heal his people. But as we all well know, that probably 50%, if not more, of our healing process comes from the Great Spirit. And so you not only got to be a physician and understand the herbs and medicines, you've got to understand the Spirit within you. And you've got to understand the Spirit within your people so that you can connect with those people and heal them in their ailments. The oldest son of Minnetonka took 30 families. And they left the Shoshone in the Snake River Valley 3 years prior to this particular Twin Falls event. And they took their people to the lower waters of the Bear River. And their camp was just down here on the river, just above the Myers Ranch. And that's where they were living. And they were fishing on the Bear River and hunting in the mountains, and they would take excursions into the Uintas and bring that. And as it turned out, it was one of the greatest camps that the Shoshones had here on the Bear River. But they were so far away that it was a major, major move for those families to get to the Snake. In that particular year, they didn't go to the Snake because they were having some serious troubles. The Winnetonka was in the lodge with his uncle. He was learning some new things. And in the background, they could hear screaming and hollering, and they could hear the people yelling. And so as they come out of their lodge, they could see riders coming from the distance, and they was riding in hard and fast. And as they got closer, they recognized the horses of the Braves, and they knew that they were coming from the camp of the oldest brother. When they rode into camp, they almost all but fell off their horses, and they were all but fell off their horses from exhaustion because they had covered so many miles in such a short time. They each had 2 horses, and they were taking turns jumping from one horse to the other so that they didn't wear their horses out and they could travel fast. When they got there, they went to Minnetonka's lodge, and there in the lodge, they let him know that his oldest son was in a coma. What had happened early that spring, one of the crazy Utes from over in the Roosevelt area had been kicked out of his tribe for evil practices. He was left on his own. Hoskoots found his way to the Bear River, to the Shoshone. And of course, being friendly to him, offered him a lodge so that he could stay there. But them not knowing that Hoskoots was an evil man. Hoskoots had started taking a fancy to the daughter of the chief. In the process of theoretically falling in love with the daughter of the chief, but the chief didn't like Hoskoots because he had a bad feeling about Hoskoots. Hoskoots was an interesting guy, and the chief knew that he couldn't be trusted. It came time for the daughter to accept a proposal in marriage, and so the Braves that had the most horses and the most furs and the most opportunities, and in some cases the most coups or coups that they had performed and to prove their bravery. Hoskoots was no different, and Hoskoots had offered 3 horses for this bride. But some of the other Braves could only offer 1 horse or 2 horses. And as it turned out, Hoskoots had bid the highest for this maiden. The chief was extremely distraught and didn't know what to do. knowing that he had to do something, he canceled the wedding. He canceled the whole thing. He was not going to allow his daughter to become the wife of this Indian. Because that would create mixed blood, and from an evil man, it would create evil blood. Hoskoots found out early in his life that he could call upon those powers of Satan, or the evil one, to help him do the things that he wanted to do. And he was not going to allow the chief to renege and not accept his wedding dowry for this maiden. And so he himself was able to create an evil spell against the chief, which ended up putting him in a coma. And once the chief was in a coma, the Indian maiden had disappeared, and so had Hoskoots. The riders had come to the Twin Falls rendezvous type thing that they had going there, and were told to Minnetonka what had happened. And they called for the eldest brother of Minnetonka, who was the medicine man, to come to the lodge, and so that they could, in essence, come to a decision how they were going to deal with this thing. And they invited the Winnetonka to be there in that council with them. And in that council, it was decided that the Winnetonka would take 3 of his strongest braves to ride with him. And so four of them would take 8 horses, and they would ride to the Bear River so that they could see if they could do something to help out the chief's oldest son. But the Winnetonka wasn't quite ready yet. He'd only been in training about 6 months, but his uncle was too old to go on that kind of a hard trip. And then they knew that the chief would be dead by the time they would get there if they didn't hurry. And so the uncle took Winnetonka back into his lodge, and there, for 4 solid hours, he was taught the ways of the Great Spirit and how to call on his powers to protect and to heal and hopefully save the chief. They mounted their horses and they started to ride. And they would jump from one horse to the other non-stop. And they would ride and they would ride and they would ride. Night would fall and they would ride through the night. The sun would come up and they would ride through the day. The sun would go down and they would ride through the night. The sun would come up and they would ride through the day. They were eating while they was riding. They was drinking while they was riding. And they would only stop for short times to give the horses a little bit of rest, a little bit of water, but yet they were still going. When they were about to leave, Minnetonka had arranged for his finest horses so that they would have good mounts to ride. And Minnetonka had a magnificent 4-year-old white stallion standing approximately 16 to 17 hands high. A very powerful horse, a beautiful horse, pure white. 7 other of the finest horses was now underneath these braves as they headed for the Bear River as quickly as they could. When they arrived, they found their uncle, who was the chief, all but dead, barely breathing and no movement at all. The Winnetonka, out of his bag of medicine, began to mix a potion so that they could start to save this chief. Through chants and prayers, he blessed that medicine and applied it to the chief. He left the chief into the care of his wife and their other children to keep administering this potion. He said that he would have to go now with his braves and they would retrieve the missing daughter to bring her home. And there again, too, they rode for a full day at top speed, and they found Hoscoot's lodge at the foot of Lone Mountain. He told his 3 braves that was there with him, he says, what I want you to do, he says, is I want you to go into the woods, and I want you to collect all of the deadfall that you can find, and I want you to bring it to Hoscoot's lodge. And I want you to lay all of that wood on Hoscoot's lodge. Hoscoot's was gone, but when they got there, the maiden was tied inside to where she couldn't run away. They were able to release her and take her up on top of Lone Mountain. And there, hidden in the brush, is where she stayed while the men started to do their work. Hoscoot's was out hunting. Then when they got the lodge covered with all of that wood, then the Winnetonka, right on the north end of Lone Mountain, sat there in the young aspen trees and found him, or took his lance, and he began to carve on that lance. As he began to carve on that lance, he began to cry. And the tears would start to come down his cheeks. The braves gathered around him to be with him there while he was doing that. And finally, after an hour of silence, the one brave finally got brave enough to ask, "Why do you cry?" And he says, "This day, Hoscoot's dies 1,000 deaths." It was getting late in the afternoon, and the Winnetonka was just finishing up his lance. And he had carved from near the bottom to where the spear point was, to the top where he had feathers. And he had his special flowers, feathers. While he was putting the finishing touches on the lance, he told 2 of his braves to go into the woods and to scour Lone Mountain and see if they could find raven feather and come back and bring it to him. The Winnetonka was still crying while he carved his staff, or carved his lance. The braves found the raven feather and brought it back, and the Winnetonka took his feathers off and then tied that lone raven feather to his lance. And when you looked on his lance, the figurines that he had carved in there were the horrible faces of a man in torture. The Winnetonka took his lance and he mounted his white stallion. Hoscoot's had finally returned from his hunting trip and came and found all this wood stacked on his lodge. He quickly entered the lodge to see if the maiden was still there and found the maiden gone. And Hoscoot's was extremely angry. And when he come running out of that lodge, the Winnetonka stood there before him on that white horse with the lance in his hand. In the west, over the mountains, just on the side of the Bear River, dark clouds started to gather. and the dark clouds started together to block out the late afternoon or early evening sun, and it started to get dark earlier than what it normally did. The clouds began to roll in darker, and the lightning started to flash in the west sky. And as the wind Tonka stood there and faced Hoskins there on his horse, and Hoskins there making threats and trying to cast spells on the wind Tonka took his lance and he threw it, and it landed and struck in the ground right there at Hoskins' feet. And Hoskins took the staff in his right hand and looked at it, and then his face turned to terror because he understood what that lance meant. And by now, the sky was totally black. As a matter of fact, it was so black it looked like it was going to start raining almost instantly. And the lightning was bellowing all around them, and lightning flashes was going on, and finally, a bolt of lightning struck Hoskins' lodge and set it afire. And it quickly burned to the ground. And in the process, Hoskins was burned in the flame. And the fire was so hot that it sunburnt that white stallion's chest. In the early part of 1890, the Pauley family moved in. This is where their homestead was going to be. And they built them a cabin. And they began to live there and try to scratch out a living. The only way that they could get money so that they could pay their taxes was to work in the tie camps and the firewood camps up Cow Canyon. Later on, there was a flume built down through the East Meadow. It went all the way on down to Altamont, to where they would throw the firewood into the flume, and the flume would take the firewood and dump off into Altamont, so the steam engines of for the railroad could have the firewood to make steam for those engines. The eldest son, in the process of building the cabin, found an old Indian lance, and it had curious carvings on it. And he thought, wow, that is a beautiful thing. But the thing that he didn't know is that the lance was the Kewaka lance. But it held great power, because it was no ordinary lance. He took that lance and took it in, and he had it inside the cabin, and it was leaning up against the wall. And then they thought it was so nice that they drilled some holes in the logs and put in some pegs so that he could mount the lance on the side of the wall as ornamentation to the cabin. While he was out hunting and working, they had discovered smoke coming from the cabin. And by the time they got to the cabin, the fire was so hot and so bad that they had a hard time. Then they didn't dare go into the cabin. But their eldest son wanted those pay vouchers so bad, because that was the only thing that they had for money, that he went into that cabin, retrieved those pay vouchers, and the roof caved in, and he never came out. He lost his life there in that cabin. The Pauley family had a son no more. The Pauley family didn't have a home anymore. Life was so tough, they had no place to go. The other Pauley brother had already built his cabin and was living right up here. The interesting thing was that they had invited the Pauley family that had lost their home down here to come live with them. And so they didn't have anything. They lost everything they had. So when they got there and they were there with their brother for not more than a month, they'd come back to this area here and they would see if there was anything left in the ashes. And the other Pauley brother was kicking around through there, and there was an old Indian lance. A little smoke and charred, but it looked pretty sharp and had a real nice point on it. And they thought, oh, that's weird. That's just laying there on the side of those ashes, those left over of that cabin. I think I'm going to take that home. He didn't realize that that was a Kewaka lance either. They had never been taught that. He brought that into their house and leaned it up against one of the walls on the inside, and they admired its beauty. And they talked about the figurines that was carved on that lance, and they were trying to figure out what it meant. Less than a week later, their house burnt down. But nobody was hurt in that fire. They just lost everything they had. They had enough. It was time to move on. It was time for the next family. They gathered up what few possessions they had, what they'd salvaged, and for one last time they walked around that cabin, and there was that Indian lance. A little more fire scarred, but it was still there. It was a beautiful thing. Caught their attention and their curiosity. And so when they were putting the last of their things, what little they had, they loaded that lance on their wagon. And as they come down through the meadow, and turn this way so they could get out into the dry country so that they could head toward Evanston, they came right down through here. And for some reason, the wife of Emil Polly didn't like that lance anymore. And so she threw it out of that wagon. And there it laid on the ground until 1950. And in 1950, the large ranch house here burnt down. And now, you know about the curse on Lone Mountain. So hopefully, nothing catches fire.
Where's that lance, Roger?
Pardon?
Where's that lance now, Roger?
I sure hope the heck it burned up in that last cabin fire. But it was a pretty tough lance.
Where was the cabin?
Pardon?
Where was the cabin at? This
Right there.
Is it a true story?
Grandma and Grandpa's cabin was right there.
Is
And
a
it burnt
true
down to the
story?
ground the first year they was here. What's that?
Is it a true story?
I can't understand it.
Is it a true story?
Well, of course. That's what yarns are, is true stories.
Sleep yet?
Well, that's good. I was worried about it. Another Louis L'Amour story.
Do you guys want to play back now?
He survived, of course. He lived. The wind talk had come back. He survived. The people stayed. And then they went back to the Twin Falls. And then when Winnetonka became an old man, they went to the Great Salt Lake. And it was late in the season, and they were there to gather salt. And what they would do is they had for centuries and generations of people, they had gouged out little basins in the rock there, in and around the Great Salt Lake, and they would take pottery and gourd dippers and stuff like that, and they would put the salt water from the Great Salt Lake into these basins. And then when they put the water into those basins, then that water would evaporate, and then they put more water in the basins, and the water would evaporate, and they put more water in the basins, and then eventually there'd be a layer of salt in that basin. And then they would scratch that salt out, and they would put it in their leather bags and their pouches and stuff. Salt was a very precious commodity, and that's what they would do. That's why they would go to it was the west side of the promontory range. And it was kind of toward the point when they would do that. And when that family, well, I shouldn't say family, that whole group of Indians, when they would go there, there'd be somewhere between 20 and 30 families. They would spend there and they would work and fill all those basins. And I mean, there was a lot of them. They spent most of their time, especially the women and children, carrying water to those basins and keeping those basins full. And the men would hunt the promontory for the game and and support them. And then also too, that late in the year, there was the pine nuts out of the pinyon pines, and they would harvest the pine nuts at the same time. The Shoshone was real good for that. They were kind of a nomadic tribe, and they'd go from place to place harvesting different things. And one of the things they would harvest, one of the things they'd harvest would be salt, and another thing they'd harvest was the pine cones off the pinyon pine on some of the slopes of the promontory mountains. Well, that particular year that they were there, which was somewhere in the 70s, 80s, when they were there, another one of them bad deals where this crazy vagabond, at that time they called them Digger Indians. They weren't Shoshone, they were Digger Indians, and they were a poor lot, starving most of the time. And this one crazy bugger somehow or another developed a taste for people and was a cannibal. And one of their young men had disappeared. He somewhere between 10 and 12 had disappeared, and they went looking and they couldn't find him, and they got worried, and 3 days had passed, and they was just going nuts to figure out where this young man had disappeared to, and they hadn't realized what had happened to him, and finally they was able to locate him tied to a juniper tree in one of the steep canyons that was secluded, and he was tied there, and this guy was, really cutting on him, and he was in bad shape, and they caught up to that guy, and they had him bound, and they were trying to decide what they were going to do to it, and they went and got the wind tonka and took him to that canyon, and he was there, and he could feel the evil before he ever got to the man, and he was there, and they wanted his advice as to what they were going to do with this guy. And so in the process of making that decision, some of those guys, they wanted to kill him right now. They wanted to stretch that boy out on an ant bed and watch him die. And cut on him a few times and give him a little of what he was giving that boy. And the one talker said, "No, we will not allow this man to create that same kind of evil in us. Because that would be wrong for us, and we would be worse than what he is, to allow this man to create that evil inside of us." And so they left him tied up, and they were trying to heal up the wounds on the young man, and the wind tonka had gone to his lodge so that he could commune with the Great Spirit and to make decisions as to what he was going to do with this evil man. And finally, when he come out of that lodge, he went there, and he had a special stick made out of cedar from one of those juniper trees, and that stick was maybe not very long, and he sat down there on a log there, and he started to carve on that stick. And as he was carving on that stick, he started to cry. And the stick wasn't very long, and so it didn't take him as long this time to make those carvings. And one of the braves that was watching and guarding that bad fellow came over and was watching him, and just watching him, and he just kept carving on that stick and was crying. And the brave didn't understand why the wind tonka would shed tears, and so he asked him, "Why do you cry?" And he says, "Tomorrow this man dies 1,000 deaths." And he continued to carve the stick. It took him about 3 hours, and he had created a new Kiwaka stick. The Kiwaka stick carried great powers from the Great Spirit, and it would heal the wrongs of the evil spirit and to cast it out. And so, when the Winnetonka finished with the Kiwaka stick, then he took that stick over to where that brave was tied up, or that fellow was tied up, and he stuck it in the ground right next to him like that. And then he told the brave that was standing guard, he says, "Go get 2 more braves and find me a raven feather." And so they went off into the hills looking in search of a raven feather, and it didn't take them long to find the raven feather. And they brought it back to him, and the Winnetonka was there patiently waiting, and he was chanting there around that fellow, and the more he would chant, the more terror was in the eyes of the evil one. And when the braves come back with the raven feather, there was 2 ravens started to circle in the sky above them. And one of them came down and landed in the juniper tree and just sat there and watched. The other raven came over to a sharp rock, and it sat there and watched. The Winnetonka took the raven feather with a leather thong and began to tie the raven feather onto the Kiwaka stick. By now the moon had come up, and it was way after dark, and the ravens were still there. They had not left. The next morning, when the sun started to come up over the Promontory Mountains, and they was right there on that west side, so it took it a while for the sun to come up over the mountains. By now, they was able to build their rawhide and their leather boats, and they took this man that was still bound, and there was a group of them in 2 boats, and they started paddling west out into the Great Salt Lake. Approximately a half a mile out into the lake was an island. And as they would go, they started to notice that the ravens were starting to follow. Now there was 4, 5, 6, maybe 7 or 8 ravens was there flying around in a circle when they entered their boats and started paddling to the west toward the island. When they got to the island in the middle of Spring Bay in the Great Salt Lake, they unloaded, and by now, there on the north slope of that island, there was 25 ravens all sitting on the rocks, watching. Those braves took that evil man and took him there to the center of the island, and there they staked him. But before they staked him, when they had him staked, then the other braves started hollowing out what they called a burial chamber. They dug a shallow pit. And as they dug that shallow pit, the Winnetonka was holding the Kiwaka stick, and he began to cry. One of the braves asked him again, "Why do you cry over this evil man?" And the Winnetonka says, "Today, this man dies 1,000 times for the evil that he has created." By now there was more than 75 ravens flying around that island. There was probably 25 or 50 lined up on the rocks. Out in the skies in the distance you could see them still coming. The ravens were coming from all around. Some of them had started flying the day before. They were so far away it took them a day and a half to get to that island. Finally they had finished their work, and they left the man bound with his hands, but they didn't bind his feet, and they didn't stake him to the ground. He was free to run, but his hands were bound. They entered their boats and they left. And as they were about to leave the island, the ravens started screaming and created a noise so bad that they wanted to hold their ears. And the ravens were circling around the island. And finally the evil one that was bound by his hands began to run like a crazy man around that island. And then the ravens started to dive in. Boom, boom, boom. And each one of them taking a piece of his flesh. They were screaming. The man was screaming. And the Indians were now paddling and leaving that island as quickly as they could. And the Winnetonka was still crying in the front of that leather boat. The man was trying to fight off the birds, and the birds kept diving in and getting him, and they was ripping off pieces of his flesh, and finally he was running around, and finally he could not stand any longer. He had wore himself right out as those birds attacked him. Boom, 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 boom. And finally he landed and fell down, and he fell into the burial chamber. When he landed in that burial chamber, the birds jumped on his back and they started ripping on him. And they just kept ripping on him and diving and ripping on him. And the blood was running from his body, and he was just ripping and tearing. And finally there was no movement in his body. 2 hours later, he finally died. 24 hours later, there was not a speck of meat on his bones. There that skeleton lay in that burial chamber. In 1865, Alfred Lamborn, a writer from New York, came to Utah in search of adventure. He became fascinated with the island in the middle of Spring Bay in the Great Salt Lake. As it turned out, it was surveyed by Colonel Gunnison of the Army Corps of Engineers as they was developing the land surveys of that area. Alfred Lamborn created, and he didn't create, what he did is he took a fancy to that island, and he had hired a boat to take him there. He went out there and visited the island, and he got a crazy idea he wanted to live on that island. And he had an even crazier idea that he wanted to grow grapes, for crying out in the night. As it turned out, he would have to evaporate water and catch rain to survive on that island. But he lived on that island for 8 months. Two weeks after he was on the island, there was a raven that come to pay him a visit. And it would land. It stayed on the rocks. They were watching him, and Alfred Lamborn had built him a house out of a shell. It was a large plate rock that was native to that island and also promontory, and it's also native to Fremont Island, the Great Salt Lake. And anyway, he started to build him a lodge out of these rocks, and he'd line that up like that, and then he would take what little brush and driftwood that he'd get off the beach. He started building a roof, and he was in the process of building that. 3 weeks later, there was another raven showed up, and the ravens would just travel around, and they'd watch him, and they'd fly away, and they'd come back, and he thought that was kind of funny, and then he got to calling them by name. they were around him so much that he got to calling them by name. And anyway, Alfred was exploring the island one day, and there on just off from the North Cliff, the North Cliff come off the beach, approximately 85 to 100 feet, and it was quite tall, and he was there on the cliff faced the north because that's where all the severe weather came and hit the island, and so the south was a lot less sharp, and just on the south of that ridge or the North Cliff, he was exploring around, and he found a burial chamber. And he got to looking around at that burial chamber and found this skeleton. He noticed that the wrists were tied together with a leather thong, but of course there was just bones. And he himself was trying to figure out who that was or what it was. Not too far from the burial chamber, he found a small stick about that long. And it had curious carvings on it. And so he brought that Kiwaka stick into his lodge that he had built there. And he began to have nightmares. And he discovered in his dreams just who and what that skeleton belonged to. Life got tough on the island. He got hungry. His grapes died. It was too hard collecting water. And it was time for him to go. But in the process, he went back to New York, and he had wrote 2 books. And one of the books that he wrote was the story of an inland sea. And in that book, he talks about the burial chamber. He talks about the skeleton that he found therein. And he tried to tell us what had happened. If some of you are real curious and want to have an experience, go to the Brigham City Library and talk to a librarian there, and she may or may not know. But there's a book downstairs that's in their archives that is not out in the public part. And that book was written by Alfred Lambourne. And it talks about an island in the middle of the Great Salt Lake. You might want to go look that up. So the Winnetonka and his group of families finally harvested their salt and their pinyon and their pine nuts, and there they went back into Idaho. And either that or they might have went over into Cache Valley. Who knows which way they went from there. But that was a story that I told to a father and son's outing, and we told it there on the shores of the Great Salt Lake. And there again, the Winnetonka let us know how just important it is to keep the Great Spirit with us. Well, kids, that's the end of that story.
You're supposed to clap. I just don't really want to.
Way past bedtime.
It's too cold. How come we're going back? We would say, but it's...
They got right chilly.
You wet folks appreciate that fire.
Yeah.
That'd be nice. Thanks,
You're welcome.